On the night of March 1st, 1932, a child vanished from his crib on the second floor of a quiet New Jersey home. The window was open. A crude wooden ladder leaned against the house, and on the windowsill, investigators found a ransom note demanding $50,000, written in broken English with bizarre misspellings. The child's name was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., the 20-month-old son of America's most famous aviator. What followed would become one of the most sensational crimes of the 20th century, a case that would grip the nation, spawn countless theories, and ultimately lead to what many called the trial of the century. This is the story of the Lindbergh kidnapping. Charles Lindbergh wasn't just famous, he was a living legend. 5 years earlier, in 1927, he had become the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, a feat that made him an instant international hero. Newspapers called him Lucky Lindy and the Lone Eagle. He was young, handsome, brave, and represented everything Americans wanted to believe about themselves. When he married Anne Morrow, the daughter of a wealthy diplomat, their wedding was front-page news. And when their son was born, the public followed every detail. The Lindberghs tried to maintain some privacy by building a home in the rural town of Hopewell, New Jersey, far from the prying eyes of reporters and photographers. But on that cold March night, their attempt at a quiet life would be shattered forever. The kidnapping was discovered around 10 o'clock in the evening. The child's nurse, Betty Gow, went to check on young Charles and found his crib empty. She immediately alerted Anne Lindbergh, who was downstairs with her husband. Charles Lindbergh grabbed his rifle and searched the grounds, but the kidnapper was long gone. The only clues were that homemade ladder, which had broken during the descent, muddy footprints beneath the window, and that ransom note. The note was peculiar. It was full of grammatical errors and strange phrasings that suggested the writer wasn't a native English speaker. It demanded $50,000 in specific denominations and warned the Lindberghs not to contact the police. But it was too late for that. Within hours, the New Jersey State Police had been notified, and by morning, the story had exploded across every newspaper in America. The investigation that followed was chaotic. Hundreds of police officers, federal agents, and volunteers descended on the Lindbergh estate. The press set up camp outside the property, turning the tragedy into a media circus. Tips poured in from across the country, most of them useless, some of them cruel hoaxes. Charles Lindbergh himself took an active role in the investigation, perhaps too active. He was a man of action, a pilot who trusted his instincts, but criminal investigation required different skills. He made decisions that would later be questioned, including his willingness to work with intermediaries who claimed they could negotiate with the kidnappers. One of these intermediaries was a retired school teacher named John Condon, who went by the nickname Jafsey. Condon placed an advertisement in a Bronx newspaper offering to act as a go-between, and remarkably, the kidnappers responded. Over the next several weeks, Condon exchanged a series of ransom notes with someone claiming to hold the Lindbergh baby. The notes continued to show the same broken English and peculiar symbols. Eventually, a meeting was arranged in a cemetery in the Bronx. There, in the darkness, Condon met a man who identified himself only as John. The man's voice had a distinct accent, possibly German or Scandinavian. He told Condon that the baby was safe, being held on a boat, and that the ransom must be paid. Charles Lindbergh, who had accompanied Condon and waited nearby in a car, later said he heard the man's voice calling out from the cemetery. That voice would haunt him. On April 2, 1932, Condon delivered $50,000 in cash to the mysterious John in another cemetery meeting. In exchange, he received a note claiming the baby could be found on a boat near Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. Lindbergh immediately flew to the location, searching desperately. But there was no boat. There was no baby. It had all been a lie. The terrible truth came on May 12, 1932. A truck driver stopped to relieve himself in a wooded area less than 5 miles from the Lindbergh home. There, partially buried in the dirt, he found the decomposed body of a small child. The remains were identified as Charles Lindbergh Jr. The medical examiner determined that the child had died from a massive skull fracture, likely on the night of the kidnapping. It appeared that as the kidnapper descended the ladder with the baby, the ladder broke, and the child's head struck either the ladder or the wall of the house. Rather than seek help, the kidnapper had apparently hidden the body and continued with the ransom plot anyway. The nation mourned. The crime was no longer just a kidnapping, it was murder. The investigation continued, but leads grew cold. The ransom money had been paid in gold certificates, a type of currency that was being phased out, which meant the bills could potentially be traced. The serial numbers had been recorded before the ransom was paid. Police and federal agents distributed lists of these numbers to banks and businesses, hoping someone would eventually try to spend the money. For more than 2 years, occasional bills would surface in New York City, but the trail never led anywhere concrete. Then, in September 1934, a break finally came. A gas station attendant in the Bronx received a $10 gold certificate from a customer and, suspicious because gold certificates were becoming rare, wrote down the license plate number of the customer's car on the bill before depositing it at the bank. When the bank checked the serial number, they discovered it was one of the Lindbergh ransom bills. The license plate led police to a carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant living in the Bronx with his wife and young son. When police searched Hauptmann's garage, they made a stunning discovery. Hidden in the walls and beneath the floorboards was more than $14,000 in ransom money. Hauptmann was arrested immediately. He insisted he was innocent, claiming that the money had been left with him by a friend named Isidore Fish, who had since died. According to Hauptmann, Fish owed him money, and when Hauptmann discovered the cash hidden in a box after Fish's death, he assumed it was repayment of the debt. Investigators didn't believe him. They found more evidence connecting Hauptmann to the crime. Wood from his attic floorboards appeared to match wood used in the kidnapping ladder. Handwriting experts compared Hauptmann's writing to the ransom notes and declared them a match. And John Condon, the intermediary who had met with the mysterious John in the cemetery, identified Hauptmann as the man he had given the ransom money to. The trial began in January 1935 in the small town of Flemington, New Jersey. It was an absolute sensation. Hundreds of reporters descended on the town. Newsreel cameras captured every moment. Spectators lined up for hours, hoping to get a seat in the courtroom. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically. They showed the ransom money found in Hauptmann's possession. They brought in handwriting experts who testified that Hauptmann had written the ransom notes. They presented the wood evidence, with an expert claiming that one rail of the kidnapping ladder had been cut from a floorboard in Hauptmann's attic. Charles Lindbergh himself took the stand and testified that the voice he had heard in the cemetery that night was Hauptmann's voice. It was powerful testimony from America's hero. The defense tried to create reasonable doubt. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial. They challenged the handwriting analysis and the wood evidence. They pointed out that Hauptmann had no criminal record and had been living a quiet life with his family. They suggested that Isidore Fish, the dead friend, might have been the real kidnapper. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming, and public opinion had already convicted Hauptmann long before the jury deliberated. After 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. The judge sentenced Bruno Richard Hauptmann to death. Despite appeals and a brief stay of execution, Hauptmann was electrocuted on April 3, 1936. He maintained his innocence until the very end. But even after Hauptmann's execution, questions lingered. Some people believed he was guilty, but hadn't acted alone. Others thought he might have been innocent, framed by overzealous investigators desperate to solve the most famous crime in America. The evidence, while substantial, had problems. The handwriting analysis was subjective. The wood evidence was disputed by other experts. And the eyewitness identifications were questionable, given the time that had passed and the circumstances. Some researchers have spent decades examining the case, finding inconsistencies and raising doubts. But the official story remains that Bruno Richard Hauptmann, acting alone, kidnapped and accidentally killed the Lindbergh baby, then callously continued with the ransom plot even after the child was dead. The Lindbergh kidnapping changed America in profound ways. The crime was so shocking, so brazen, that Congress passed a federal law making kidnapping a federal offense if the victim is transported across state lines. It became known as the Lindbergh Law. The case also highlighted the dangers of media circuses around criminal trials. The Flemington trial was a zoo, with reporters bribing witnesses and spectators, treating it like entertainment. This eventually led to reforms in how courts handle high-profile cases. For the Lindbergh family, the tragedy was devastating. They had lost their firstborn son in the most horrible way imaginable. The media attention became unbearable. Eventually, Charles and Anne Lindbergh moved to Europe, seeking privacy and peace. They would have more children, and they would try to move forward, but the shadow of that March night in 1932 would follow them forever. The case remains one of the most analyzed crimes in American history. Books have been written, documentaries produced, theories debated. Some people believe Hauptmann was guilty beyond any doubt. Others see him as a convenient scapegoat, an immigrant with a German accent who fit the profile investigators had created. The truth, like so many historical mysteries, may never be fully known. What we do know is that a child died, a family was destroyed, and a nation lost some of its innocence. The Lindbergh kidnapping showed that even the most famous, most beloved Americans weren't safe from tragedy. It showed that evil could reach into the most protected homes and steal what was most precious. And it reminded everyone that behind the headlines and the sensationalism, there was real human suffering that could never be undone. That's all for today. Don't forget to subscribe and be kind to each other.